The British government publishes a summary of a review of funding sources for Islamist extremist organizations in the UK, but not the review itself. Why is it proving to be so controversial? And a woman in Saudi Arabia has been arrested after a video of her wearing a miniskirt went viral. Just how difficult is life in the oil-rich kingdom for women, and are human rights groups overreacting? Welcome to The Point. Live from Beijing, I'm Li Xin. Welcome to part 2 of our special series on anti-terrorism, and our focus today is the UK. Who is funding Islamist extremism in the UK? That is the question an inquiry commissioned by former Prime Minister David Cameron has been working on. Although the report was completed earlier this year, the British government has decided not to publish it, citing personal information and national security reasons. This has led to huge controversy as the opposition accused the government of a cover-up. To get the full story, I'm pleased to be joined in London by Jonathan Sachadoti, a seasoned journalist who covers terrorism-related topics extensively, and in Beijing by Yan Shuai, Executive Chief of Organized Crime Studies of the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Mr. Sachadoti, now the summary also reviewed that overseas funding is a significant source of income for a small number of organizations. The opposition parties criticized the government for not identifying which countries the foreign funds originate from, so as to prioritize the protection of the UK's trade and diplomacy, especially in relation to Saudi Arabia, which has been accused of being a major source of funding. Given that the value of the arms Britain sells to Saudi Arabia make it the biggest ever export deal in British history, are you surprised?
Good evening, Shin. I guess we could say we're not surprised in some respects. The government has said that it's not releasing the full details of the report and its full findings because, as you say, they point to personal information that might be compromised in that report. But there are also certainly other considerations they would have had, as you say, diplomatic considerations, trade considerations. Also, there's potentially significant material in there for national security, and they won't want to compromise anything which is confidential. Part of that report has had input from MI5, the intelligence services, and that would mean that that part at the very least would be something they wouldn't want to see released. However, we don't know exactly what's in the report. We only have this very brief summary from Amber Rudd, the Home Secretary, so we can't really tell exactly why it is they've decided not to publish it. There is also the more cynical possibility that the report simply isn't that good, didn't have enough information in it, and didn't really give them anything to work from. If that's the case, that would be another reason to hide its full publication.
Mr. Yen, given the importance of UK arms sales to Saudi Arabia, a cynic might say that economic benefits are far more important than the right of public to be kept informed. Do you share this view?
Yes, actually it's being said that due to the sensitivity of the report, the British government opposite to release the full report, but it is widely thought that the Saudi Arabia and some maybe Gulf countries are behind the foreign funds for the British-based extremist organizations, and it has been a long tradition for the Gulf countries, especially in Saudi Arabia, to use the oil money to support the extremist organizations in Central Asia, in Europe, in America, and even in Southeast Asia. And actually, I think why British government take this decision, I think it has been a delicate consideration. It's been a matter of benefit and cost, and that does not mean that the British government will do nothing if the report has found that the Saudi Arabia was behind it. Maybe the UK government and the Saudi Arabia will talk the issue behind the table.
I think another important aspect that gets neglected in the media coverage is actually that a major source of funding comes from comes from public donation. Is there any credible evidence of a connection between the recent terrorist attacks, Mr. Sachadoti, and the funding by public in the UK? Have British citizens in some way themselves contributed to terrorism on their own doorsteps?
It's important to note what Amber Rudd did say about this report, and she said that it didn't look into those issues. It wasn't specifically looking at terrorism funding, and that is important because it shows the distinction that the government makes, and previous governments have also made, between extremism and terrorism. That is to say, even if a terrorist act is inspired by extremist Islamist ideology, it doesn't mean that they have necessarily previously connected it directly with that ideology where it wasn't, let's say, resulting in violent acts. Now there seems to be something of a shift towards doing that. Theresa May said in the aftermath of the recent terrorist attacks that were carried out in the UK that it was time that we made that connection, and that Britain got tough not only on extremists who are carrying out violent acts, but also on those who are spreading the ideology. And that's where this report could focus, because what we're looking at, for example, is organisations which the report says make themselves out to be charities. Mm-hmm. Some of them probably are registered charities in the UK, some may not be, but may be giving the impression that they are to potential donors. And those organisations that are charities will come under the scrutiny of the Charities Commission, mm-hmm.
which
is there to regulate charities, but is somewhat toothless even when it is investigating charities. All in all, it's hard to draw a line to join the dots between individual donors and acts of terrorism, but it's certainly possible that people are misguidedly or deliberately giving money to organisations that pursue fanatical Islamist ideologies, and that those organisations are somehow funneling some of that money into terrorist acts.
Yeah, well, when people make a donation, shouldn't they inform themselves about the true nature or the agenda of the organization? Are they just being gullible, Mr. Sapchadoti? Charity seems to have been the magic word to make people reach for their pocket. And what's the regulatory responsibility of the government in this regard?
No, that's absolutely right. I think that playing on the good-spirited nature of British people from any denomination or background, it means that certain organisations have been able to pose as charities, to say they have a humanitarian cause that they're aiming to support, and in fact to use the money in a different way. But also, I think we can't be too naive and assume that the people giving money to organisations that do put it towards extremist ideology or even acts are necessarily unaware of what's happening with that money. If somebody in the United Kingdom subscribes to a severe terrorist ideology, an Islamist ideology, for example, and they wish to give money in a way to an organisation that could support terrorist acts or extremism or spreading of extremist ideology, then they may know where to put that money, they may know which charities to put that money through, and the regulators have to deal with that. They have to go in and examine these charities, not just when they're reported to them by others. I mean, there has been, for example, the case of somebody found in the courts to have been an extremist, and yet for his position as a trustee on a charity not to have been investigated because it wasn't necessarily put to the Charities Commission. So the Charities Commission needs to be more proactive, and needs to, when it does find failings within a charity, not just give them a rap on the knuckles about that one trustee, but to bear in mind the fact that it could have been the sole purpose of that charity to fund extremism and even terrorism.
Exactly. Now the summary, Mr. Yen, the summary revealed there is evidence of organizations of extremist concern seeking to avoid regulatory oversight. How serious is this a problem, and how big is this a challenge for any government?
Yes, due to the increased pressure in the terrorist financing from the Western governments, to the extremist and terror groups are taking various kinds of measures to prevent being monitored by the government. And one way is to run its own charity organizations, and in this way it will increase its own credibility for the Muslim donators, and also it will be very good cover for them to run their business legally in the Western countries.
Now, Mr. Sapchadoti, another thing that strikes me is also, since the release of the summary, people in the press seem not to be interested to talk about how individuals have been misled to fund extremist organizations, but rather focusing on criticizing the Conservative government. Is there anything wrong there?
Well, of course, there's something wrong with necessarily putting all the responsibility in one place if it's not deserved. The Conservative government has a job to do, and also speaks quite a tough line when they talk about this, especially in the wake of terror attacks. But whether or not they're following up and doing what's required is another matter. Now, this report not being published could point to the fact that they're doing plenty behind the scenes. This could mean that they are doing what they need to with Saudi Arabia. They're trying, for example, potentially to stop the Saudi funding of mosques in the United Kingdom. Many mosques in the United Kingdom are registered as charities. And then when we look at issues such as the idea of Saudi textbooks or Saudi educational curriculums being used or followed within those mosques or other religious learning institutions in the UK, that's potentially a very big problem for the UK. So hopefully they're dealing with those things in a quiet way. But whether or not this is solely the responsibility of the Conservative Party, one can't know. The Labour Party has its own problems in relation to terrorism, with its leader Jeremy Corbyn having previously called people from Hamas and Hezbollah, Middle Eastern terror organisations, friends, and having invited them into the House of Commons, as he believed that that is friendly, inclusive behaviour. So certainly both parties have plenty of criticism from the outside and from within.
Yeah. Mr. Yen, how do you see the problem or the lesson that can be learned from what we are seeing here? First of all, I think the discovery that the major part of funding comes from public, and sometimes people not knowingly donate to extremist organizations. What lesson can be learned from there for other countries, for instance for China, in its fight against anti-terrorism and anti-extremism work?
Firstly, I think the government has the responsibility to raise the awareness that for the Muslim public, that their donation for the charity organizations may go to the extremist organizations. So the government needs to tell the Muslims to be aware of this. And on the other hand,
And also, are we only talking about Muslims as members of the public donating to these organizations? What about the other people of other faiths of the public?
Yes, because in the Islam religion, the donation is one of the fifth pillar of Islam. So the Muslim public are encouraged to donate a certain amount of its money to the needy people, and extremist groups and terror groups also exploit these kind of advantages to encourage and to the Muslims to donate for their organization's operations. And the extremists always said that if you cannot fight to join the jihad, you can donate, and this is one way of joining the jihad. So some Muslims may be encouraged or brainwashed by the extremist ideologies, so as to will give the money to the extremist organization.
Yeah, we have to leave it there. Definitely the conversation will go on, I believe. But many thanks to the two gentlemen, Jonathan Sachadotti, a seasoned journalist and political analyst, joining us from London, and Yen Shuai from the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. Well, we all think the right to information is paramount, and at first glance we might question why it is that the British government chooses not to publish details of organizations it knows to be involved in extremism. But of course, it's never that simple. If Saudi Arabia really is a major source of extremist funding in the UK, then the British government has a serious problem on its hands. Does it put at risk its massive arms sales to the Saudi kingdom in order to appease the human rights watchers? Or does it put the UK economy first and work behind the scenes to counter extremism? By not publishing the report, the British government tried to avoid having to make a decision for the time being. You have been watching The Point with me, Liu Xin. We'll take a short break and we'll be back right after this short break. A Saudi Arabian woman was arrested by police for wearing suggestive clothing, Saudi state television reported on Tuesday. The woman by the name of Hulud was said to be a model. Earlier, she was shown in an online video wearing a miniskirt and a cropped top in one of the nation's most conservative provinces. As her video went viral over the weekend, her attire drew strong criticism from the public, with many saying she was running foul of the conservative Islamic dress code in Saudi Arabia. The kingdom imposes some of the strictest rules in the world on women's appearance and behavior. They are required to wear a loose-fitting garment together with a headdress covering everything but the eyes and the hands. They are not allowed to drive or to socialize with men who are not related to them. Now, the exact fate of the woman remains unclear. For more insight, I'm joined by Brian Salter, a broadcaster and author who worked in Saudi Arabia for years. Brian, thank you very much for joining us. Are you surprised by the reaction to the video and the picture?
I'm not surprised by the reaction to the video at all. In Saudi Arabia, it's a very conservative country, and certainly at least 60% of the population would be very much behind the fact that she should not have done this. It is against Saudi law, which is based on Sharia law, and therefore many people will think that she went way over the top. I am surprised by the fact that a Saudi girl or Saudi woman would actually have done this in the first place. One has to ask why she did it. Maybe she thought just posting a video of herself like that would not get picked up anywhere and it would be purely for her friends. And that's one thing. And many people do go into the desert, especially at weekends, and they don't wear abayas in the desert and nobody turns a hair about it.
Yeah, but the fact that she put it on the social media and the fact that social media such as Facebook is very popular in Saudi Arabia makes this gone viral.
Yes, I think maybe the surprise to her was the fact it went viral. Social media, as you say, is extremely popular.
But what do you think is her intention in doing that? I mean, she must have been aware of the consequences of her posting this video online.
It may have been purely to show her friends, because many people post things like that to show their friends and nothing happens. In this case, it was picked up by the media after it went viral, and that's maybe what she was not expecting. One has to question why she did it in the first place. All Saudi women would know this would be a dangerous thing to do.
Sure. Now, it's reported that she has been arrested by the so-called religious police in Saudi Arabia. How powerful are they? How big is their remit?
Well, the Mutawain, which comes under the remit of the Commission for the Promotion of Virtue and the Prevention of Vice, which is its full title, they've actually had their stuffing taken out of them about a year ago, April of last year. They used to have the power to arrest as well as to monitor all the behaviour of people in public, or even in private, not just public. Last year, they had the power of arrest taken away from them. They have been criticised a lot over recent years, and have been, many of them were criticised by the fact they used to be convicts who got out of prison because they were able to recite the Quran from beginning to end, and they got a job in the Mutawain because they could do that. They didn't have any other credentials at all. So they've been heavily criticised for a number of years. That power is being taken away from them.
Now, many people in the West see restrictions placed on women as violation of their human rights, but it seems that many Saudis don't see it that way. What is your take? What is your observation after living and working there for years?
I was quite surprised when I first went there that many Saudi women don't see this as a problem at all. Now, one can say that you are a product of your upbringing, and as I said, 60% of the country firmly believe that a woman's place is the way it is defined within Saudi Arabia, and they look askance at the way women behave in the West. Having said that, there's also growing change in, especially among younger people, that they see, for instance, television from abroad, they see social media, they want to change their own lifestyles to reflect more what they see in the West, and they see nothing wrong with that. And there is more and more examples of people now, for instance, women are not allowed to drive in Saudi Arabia. It's not against the law to drive, but they don't drive because of the custom, and if they do drive, they're arrested by the police. There was, I think, a couple of years ago, if you like, a protest where a number of women got behind the wheel and went on a convoy driving to show they should be allowed to drive. A lot of small but effective demonstrations like that are taking place for women who are trying to assert their rights.
Well, the Washington Post, however, ran an article this week in which it claimed that Islam is a violent dogma. Of course, this is an opinion piece, right? Islam is a violent dogma with the strictest gender roles that set men at the top, farming animals second, land and housing third, and then somewhere after pets and possessions, women. Are things really as bad as that for women in Saudi Arabia?
In some parts of Saudi Arabia, yes. I remember driving once to Tabuk in the very northwest of Saudi Arabia, near the Jordanian border. And I remember seeing there was a Bedou driving a pickup truck, and in the passenger seat was a goat. And when you looked in the pickup at the back was his wife. Now, that made me laugh, but it actually is not uncommon at all. You see that very commonly. In some parts of, especially...
Maybe it was just an individual incident where he had the goat first in the truck.
It may be, but I've seen more, quite a few occasions of that kind of thing. In the north of Saudi Arabia, it's much more fundamental than in the south and west of Saudi Arabia. Jeddah, for instance, is regarded as quite liberal. But if you go north of Riyadh, you find a lot of women, for instance, have to cover their hands as well as their faces. In Jeddah, they would not have to cover their hands.
But what do you think of this statement here, giving a general blanket of Islam as this violent dogma?
I seriously wonder if the woman who wrote that actually has been to Saudi Arabia herself, and I suspect the answer is no. You find a lot of do-gooders in the West making criticism of places they haven't been to, and they don't actually understand the social norms within that society. Now, I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but many people criticize without knowing the true facts. I suspect in this case that was what happened.
Basically, actually, if you have been to the Middle East or some Middle Eastern countries where religion plays a very strong role, you would understand how people behave in certain ways, because that is really the way how people behave every day, for thousands of years, and people respect that kind of norm. Another thing very interesting, this woman is said to be a Saudi woman who posted this video. What about if it had been a foreigner? For instance, we all know this picture where US President Donald Trump visited Saudi Arabia in May, and the First Lady Melania Trump and First Daughter Ivanka Trump did not actually wear any headscarves either, but there seemed to have been little public outcry at that time. Is there any double standard we're talking about here? I think
it's total double standards, and I'm sure that in private there were a lot of tut-tuts going on. Because it was Ivanka Trump, nobody said anything. But if a woman walks down the road in Saudi Arabia, albeit a foreigner, they still have the mutawain going after them. It used to be that the mutawain would carry canes and they'd hit their ankles to tell them to cover up. They'll be told to put on a headdress or whatever. As I say, certain parts of Saudi Arabia are more liberal than others. I remember seeing a TV series in Saudi Arabia, a cooking series, and the woman who was doing the cooking demonstrations was not only covered from head to foot, she was wearing gloves. And when you saw her cutting the onions, for instance, wearing these black gloves, and they were getting so disgusting, you would never have wanted to eat the stuff she was making. But that was the norm in Saudi Arabia.
That was the way how they do it, for all the time. So it might be disgusting to you, for the other people who are watching it might just be, another day of cooking.
Yes, I think in the West it's very easy to criticize another nation's social norms without understanding it. When you get to Saudi Arabia, you understand that religion drives everything. You have a meeting in the office, suddenly the call for prayer goes out and the meeting stops, and people go out and they do their prayers and come back in. You're shopping in the supermarket, suddenly the shutters come down, people do their prayers and come back in.
And there is nothing wrong or right about it. It's the way it's done. How do you see things changing, though, especially with the new Crown Prince and his Vision 2030 about changing the society in a gradual, incremental way, for instance, allowing concerts to be held? How does that figure bode for the future of the country?
Well, I think you have to remember two things. First of all, in Saudi Arabia, the oil is eventually running out, and they're planning for when the oil does run out. Okay, they've got things like bauxite and other minerals they can use, but also unemployment is a problem. Many people have had government jobs as a gateway to being able to earn money for the future. But that is changing now as well. Also, you have to remember that social media is very important in Saudi Arabia, and half the population are under the age of 25. Now, when people see on social media around the world how other people want to live, they start getting ideas that they would like to live that way themselves. So there is a rapid call for change, and things are slowly changing. And the new Crown Prince understands this very well. He has said he will bring in the idea of concerts, which have not been allowed up till now. You can't go to the cinema in Saudi Arabia. You can't take a friend to Starbucks if they're opposite sex. If I took you to Starbucks, we would be arrested and thrown in prison because we'd be breaking Saudi law, the law of Kulwa. And therefore, things are changing, but it'll be a slow process, I think.
Yeah. How do you see the path of change for Saudi women to enjoy greater rights? What would be the right way to go forward? I mean, of course, as you said, a video like this could play some role, but things will not happen overnight, right? The convoy that you talked about, women driving, of course, got the topic very much in the news, but again, women still are not allowed to drive. What would be the path forward for things to change?
A lot of women are now writing articles that are being published, which used never to be published. A friend of mine, actually, who now works in London, regularly gets things published in the Saudi newspapers, pointing out how things are changing and encouraging change. There is this huge call afoot, especially because of social media, and I think the Crown Prince especially understands this, as well as King Salman understands this, and things are slowly changing. But the royal family have to get the side of the ulama, the religious establishment, to follow on what they want to do, and that's no easy task. So it's going to be a slow process.
For the people who are maybe interested in going to Saudi Arabia, what would be your one-sentence advice?
You can't go to Saudi Arabia just for tourism. You certainly can't go if you're a woman on your own. If you go as part of the Hajj or part of the pilgrimage, yes, the tourism is now starting in Saudi Arabia. They have now got a Saudi Commission for Tourism, which is now actively trying to promote tourism in Saudi Arabia. But again, it's a very early stages of tourism in Saudi Arabia altogether. When I was there, tourism did not exist.
What about for people who want to understand this country a bit better? Where can we get information? How can we really find out what's going on in that country?
It's very difficult one has to say. Of course, there's an awful lot of information now on the internet, but I remember when I was writing books about Saudi Arabia, there were very few sources I could go to, apart from going to the original sources in Saudi itself and asking people on the spot. That is not easy.
What would be the advice that you would give to a Western viewer who are watching this, you know, what they should keep in mind when they look at situations like, you know, women's situation in Saudi Arabia and Afghanistan? There are many different shades of grey. What would you say to them?
I would say don't be ready to judge too harshly or too quickly. Yes, we all have our norms, and even I was shocked at many of the things I saw, but it's very easy to judge other people from your own point of view without understanding the background of how they got there in the first place. I loved Saudi Arabia. I really enjoyed my time in Saudi Arabia, but I was also shocked at many of the things I witnessed. And I think you've got to have an open mind and try to understand the point of view from their point of view.
And not be judgmental, maybe. Thank you very much, Brian Salter, a broadcaster and author. Now, here is my last point. For those of us who never travel to these countries, it is difficult to understand how people act or react in certain ways, because we use our standards to gauge their behavior, regardless of the background and the circumstances. I do not agree with how women are treated unequally in these countries, but I'm also against the mentality of, if this is good for me, it must be good for you, and you have to take it. It will take quite some time until women's rights eventually improve in different parts of the world. The Saudis themselves will have to own the process. That's all for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, follow me on Twitter or visit our Facebook page using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN Live to watch our show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.